Pay close attention to how a camera that was explicitly programmed to ignore humans completely ended up becoming the single most important piece of evidence in saving one. Before we open up this file and look at the photos, do me a quick favor. Down in the comments, tell me the absolute most remote place you've ever hiked or camped. I read every single one of your answers, and if you want the next deep dive wilderness mystery to find your feed, take 2 seconds, hit the like button, and subscribe. Ready? Let's get into it. Deep in the backcountry, Percy Flat was a completely closed basin. The local forestry district had fenced it off 4 years prior with a very specific goal: to let a severely overgrazed, damaged meadow finally recover. When District Ranger Elliot Bradock trekked out to the flat to check on the monitoring equipment, he wasn't checking a standard trail cam. If you spend time in the woods, you know how trail cams work. Something moves, the infrared sensor trips, and the camera snaps a picture. That is not what was mounted on the post at Percy Flat. Bradock was checking an interval unit. It was the mechanical heartbeat of a vegetation recovery study, programmed with brutal simplicity. Fire exactly once every hour, on the hour, day and night. Rain, snow, pitch black, or blinding sunlight. It did not matter if an elk was standing directly in front of the lens or if the meadow was completely still. The camera clicked. That distinction is the linchpin for everything that follows in this case, so lock that detail in your mind. This camera was never trying to catch a fleeting moment or a passing hiker. It was trying to catch an entire season. It was built to tell the slow, cumulative story of ground cover returning, told one flat, static frame at a time, exactly 60 minutes apart. The district desperately needed this data. For decades, Percy Flat had been grazed down to the dirt by commercial cattle, and nobody actually knew how long natural recovery took in this specific high-altitude soil. The district needed hard numbers before they faced the political nightmare of telling wealthy permit holders that other grazing areas were going to be closed too. An hourly, unmanned interval camera was the perfect employee. It was cheap, it was patient, and most importantly, it didn't require a human being to hike in and trample the very grass they were trying to study. The entire scientific foundation of this project relied on the absolute assumption that the meadow was completely isolated. That assumption held perfectly, right up until the memory card proved it was a lie. When Bradock pulled the card in early October, 11 weeks into the project, he expected to see a flipbook of growing grass. Maybe a few deer grazing in the background, or the shifting shadows of the pines. Instead, as he clicked through the images in chronological order on his laptop, a ghost began to appear in the landscape. It started in week 4, a faint, bruised discoloration in the vegetation. By week 6, the grass was lying flat. By week 8, it was an undeniable, carved-out path. A thin, unmistakable trace of packed-down dirt cutting a dead-straight diagonal line from a broken gap in the southern fence line, straight across the meadow, and disappearing into a dense stand of timber on the far side. Here is a fundamental truth about the wilderness. Animals do not walk in straight lines like that. Deer wander, elk browse. They meander, grazing in looping, unpredictable patterns, rarely stepping on the exact same 6 inches of soil twice. Straight lines in the woods mean purpose, and purpose almost always means a human. But this is where the mystery becomes a mathematical anomaly. If an ordinary motion-triggered camera had been watching that gap, it would have fired every time the intruder walked by. Bradock would have had a neat, well-lit folder of exactly who was ruining his study. But remember, this camera was a metronome. It fired once an hour, regardless of what was there. For a person to be caught by this camera, they had to be crossing that specific stretch of grass during the exact 1/250th of a second that the shutter clicked. Do the math. If someone takes 3 minutes to cross a meadow once a day, the odds of their crossing perfectly aligning with the hourly top-of-the-clock click are roughly 1 in 5. Over 11 weeks, you wouldn't get a clear portrait. You would get a scattering of maddening, blurred near misses. And that is exactly what Bradock found hidden among the 920 clicks of the shutter.
He isolated 4 usable frames. One image showed nothing but a worn hiking boot mid-stride, cut off at the ankle by the edge of the lens. Another caught a blurred shoulder and the frayed strap of a canvas backpack moving quickly out of frame. The third was ruined by low evening light. But the fourth frame, the one that made Bradock slam his laptop shut and hike back out to the woods, caught a full figure. It was a lone person, frozen in a fraction of a second. But it was their posture that caught Bradock's eye. They weren't hiking. They were moving with a flat, unhurried, agonizingly careful certainty. It was the stiff, deliberate carriage of someone who had walked this exact route so many times they could do it in the dark, and more importantly, the posture of someone whose body was entirely consumed by the act of managing pain. Bradock followed the ghost path. He walked the illegal trail backward from the fence line, through the heavy timber, and up a shallow, hidden draw that you would never see unless you knew to look for it. At the top of the draw, he found the source. It was a camp, tucked against a low rock outcropping that blocked the wind. But it didn't look like a typical squatter's camp or a survivalist's hideout. It was meticulous. There was a single weathered tent. A low camp chair was positioned not to face the sweeping valley view, but angled directly into the afternoon sun. That detail alone spoke volumes. The person who lived here sat for hours at a time, using the solar heat to warm their body. The micro details of the camp told an even louder story. A wooden walking stick leaned against the rock, but it wasn't worn down at the top like a hiker would use it for balance. It was compressed and polished smooth in the middle, exactly where someone would grip it with 2 hands to push themselves up from a seated position. On a flat rock nearby sat a row of over-the-counter pain medication bottles. They were meticulously labeled with masking tape, organized by dosage and time of day. This was the rationing system of someone who knew they couldn't just walk to a pharmacy when they ran out. Most telling of all, the camp stool was positioned at the exact height of the tent's zipper. The occupant didn't bend down to open their tent. They couldn't. This wasn't the camp of someone hiding from the law. This was an open-air convalescent ward. The person living here had organized their entire remaining physical budget around getting through 24 hours with as little movement as humanly possible. Her name was Darlene Voss. She was 44 years old. When Bradock finally sat down to talk with her, the pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating clarity. Darlene had spent 19 years on a concrete warehouse floor. For nearly 2 decades, she worked a receiving line, lifting, twisting, and setting down heavy boxes in the exact same repetitive motion, thousands of times a shift. The injury that ended her career wasn't a dramatic, bloody accident. It was the slow, inevitable erosion that any orthopedic surgeon could have predicted. The harsh American math of trading your cartilage for an hourly wage until the equation no longer favors the house. She suffered 2 severely herniated discs and permanent nerve damage. Standing for more than 5 minutes was agony. Walking more than 100 yards was a logistical mission. She had tried to fight through it. She begged for lighter duty, accepted part-time hours, and eventually was forced into unpaid medical leave. She genuinely believed, the way so many hardworking people do, that 19 years of loyalty meant something. She thought the company would find a place for her. They did not. When her leave ran out, her termination letter arrived in the mail. The warehouse simply hired a new 20-something whose spine hadn't yet caught up to the brutal reality of the work. Darlene filed for Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, the very month her body gave out.
That was 14 months before Elliot Bradock ever stepped foot in her camp. And what happened to Darlene in those 14 months is the dark, silent reality for millions of Americans. The system is a labyrinth designed to test your endurance. Roughly 2 out of every 3 initial SSDI applications are flat-out denied on the very first pass. Darlene's denial arrived 5.5 months after she filed. By then, the wait had entirely vaporized her meager savings and her unemployment benefits. Following the rules, she requested a reconsideration, gathered more medical charts, and waited again. 6 months later, she hit the second wall, a stage that rejects 85% of applicants. Denied again. By the time that second letter arrived, Darlene had missed 4 months of rent and was evicted. She had only one option left: requesting a hearing in front of an administrative law judge. This is the stage where valid claims are finally approved, but it is also the ultimate endurance test. In many districts, it takes 1.5 years just to get a date on the calendar. Darlene Voss was not a cynic. She reasonably believed that once a judge actually looked at her MRI scans and her 19-year work history, she would win her case. Her problem wasn't a lack of proof. Her problem was time. How exactly is a 44-year-old woman with a shattered spine, 0 income, and no family supposed to survive for 18 months waiting for a hearing? She couldn't work. She couldn't afford a roof. So she vanished into Percy Flat. It was quiet, closed to the public, and most importantly, it was the only place she could exist without money. She engineered her survival around a single, agonizing daily walk, a dead straight line to the fence gap to collect water, walking exactly the same 60 feet, never varying her stride, never wasting a single ounce of physical energy. Technically, everything Darlene was doing was illegal. She was indefinitely squatting on protected federal land. She was technically compromising a government vegetation study by trampling the recovering grass. By the letter of the law, Bradock should have cited her, dismantled her camp, and forced her back onto the concrete sidewalks of a city shelter system that her body couldn't handle. But Bradock didn't write a citation. Instead, he looked at the 920 time-stamped photographs on his laptop and realized he was holding a miracle. There is a profound, bitter irony in disability law. Insurance companies and government examiners spend millions of dollars every year hiring private investigators to stalk claimants. They use hidden cameras and surveillance footage, desperate to catch a disabled person lifting a heavy grocery bag or walking just a little too far, using that footage to legally destroy their claim and call them a fraud. Surveillance is almost always a weapon used against the vulnerable. But Darlene Voss's 920 frames did the exact opposite. Because this was a blind interval camera, it had inadvertently created the most bulletproof, unfalsifiable record of profound physical limitation ever captured. It proved that a woman, given an entire sprawling, beautiful wilderness to explore freely, chose to walk one single, measured, rigid line, once a day, and spent the remaining 23 hours sitting in a chair facing the sun to soothe her back. It was an 11-week, disinterested, continuous, unstaged documentary of human suffering. A person avoiding effort looks very different from a body desperately managing pain. The camera proved she wasn't faking. With Darlene's permission, Bradock exported the raw data from the district's vegetation study and submitted it as supporting medical evidence for her federal SSDI file. It wasn't the only proof she had, but it was the kind of raw, undeniable documentation that an administrative law judge simply cannot ignore. It was captured by a machine that didn't know she existed and had no motive to lie. It didn't magically fast-track her case. The bureaucracy still ground on, taking exactly as long as it always does. Millions of people are currently trapped in that exact same waiting room, and almost none of them get lucky enough to have a government science experiment accidentally photographing their daily survival. But Darlene's story is a testament to what happens when we look closer at the data we ignore. The camera at Percy Flat was installed to measure how long it takes for a broken meadow to heal. It succeeded.
But purely by accident. It also measured how long a broken person has to wait for a blind system to finally see them. The only path through that bureaucratic nightmare was a 60-foot dirt trail, walked with such agonizing consistency that a camera built to miss her caught her anyway. Every great wilderness mystery starts with something that simply does not belong in the frame. A straight path in a wild meadow, a shadow in the grass. Pay close attention to the blank spaces in the evidence, because sometimes a season of near misses is exactly what it takes to prove the truth.